My God.
She stepped in front of me. Who touched my mother?
Porcelain shrapnel rained across the Persian rug. Clara didn't throw herself in front of the Don's mother out of bravery. She tripped. The slap meant for the matriarch connected with Clara's jaw instead, fracturing the silence and sealing the fate of the woman who threw it. The industrial kitchen of the Costa estate smelled violently of roasted garlic, lye soap, and the panicked sweat of 24 underpaid staff members. Clara stood at the stainless steel prep station, her hands submerged in a basin of scalding water. Her knuckles were split, the skin around her nails chewed raw and stinging from the harsh dish detergent. She scrubbed a cast-iron skillet with a wire brush, the scraping sound grinding into her exhausted temples. She was 23, but her joints ached with the heavy, settling weariness of someone twice her age. Her uniform, a stiff, black synthetic dress with a white apron that tied too tight around her ribs, chafed against her collarbones. Her shoes were the real tragedy. Black, slip-resistant, bought second-hand from a thrift bin. They were half a size too large. She had stuffed the toes with folded paper towels, but they still slipped at the heel, raising weeping blisters that pulsed with every step she took. Tonight was the Equinox Gala, a polite word for a syndicate summit. Clara didn't care about the politics. She didn't care that the men in the dining room smuggled weapons or laundered money through shell corporations. She cared that rent for her moldering, windowless basement apartment was due in 3 days, and if she dropped another piece of crystal stemware, Greta would fire her. Clara, the sharp bark cut through the clatter of pots and the hiss of the industrial deep fryers. Greta, the head housekeeper, marched toward her. Greta was a woman, constructed entirely of sharp angles and sour moods, smelling perpetually of aerosol hairspray and stale peppermint. "Dry your hands." Immediately, Greta snapped, thrusting a heavy silver tray onto the counter beside the sink. Clara hurriedly wiped her wet hands on her apron, ignoring the damp chill that seeped through the fabric to her stomach. She looked down at the tray. Sitting atop it was a single, fragile porcelain teapot, painted with delicate cornflowers, a matching cup, a silver strainer, and a small dish of raw honey. The setup easily cost more than Clara made in 6 months. "Madame Costa requested her chamomile," Greta said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She is in the east parlor. The men are finishing their cigars in the billiards room, which means the wives and the mistresses are prowling the halls. You will walk in, you will place the tray on the side table, you will pour exactly 1 cup, and you will leave. You do not look at them, you do not speak." Clara swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes, ma'am." "And for God's sake, pick up your feet," Greta hissed, eyeing Clara's battered shoes. "If you scuff the mahogany, I'll take it out of your final check." Clara grabbed the handles of the tray. The silver was cold and heavy. Her forearm strained immediately as she lifted it. She turned away from the noise and heat of the kitchen, pushing through the heavy swinging doors that separated the servant quarters from the reality of the Costa family. The transition was always jarring. The temperature dropped by 10 degrees. The chaotic noise of the kitchen was instantly swallowed by the thick, sound-dampening wool of the corridor runners. The air here didn't smell like bleach and grease. It smelled of beeswax wood polish, expensive white lilies arranged in suffocatingly large vases, and the lingering, peppery bite of high-end cologne. Clara walked slowly, her eyes fixed on the rim of the teapot. The liquid sloshed gently inside, a golden amber against the white porcelain. Don't spill it. Don't trip. Don't breathe too hard. She hated the east parlor. It was too large, too full of things waiting to be broken. As she neared the arched doorway, she could hear voices, female voices. One was low, raspy, and dismissive. Rosa Costa, the matriarch, Damian Costa's mother. The woman was in her late 70s, frail as a dried leaf, but she commanded a terrifying amount of residual power. The other voice was younger, sharper, pitching upward with uncontrolled agitation. "It is a blatant insult, Rosa, and you know it." Clara paused just outside the doorframe. She needed to go in, but the hostility in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. "You are a guest in my son's house, Camilla." Rosa's voice drifted out, bored and irritated. "You will lower your tone, or You will wait in the car. Clara took a breath, adjusted her grip on the heavy tray, and stepped into the room. The parlor was suffocatingly warm, a fire blazing in the massive marble hearth, despite the mild weather outside. The heat made the smell of Rosa's heavy lavender perfume cloying, sticking to the back of Clara's throat. Rosa was seated in a high-backed velvet armchair, a cashmere blanket draped over her thin knees. Standing over her was Camilla. Clara recognized her from the gossip in the laundry room. Camilla was the new, very young, very volatile wife of a rival underboss from the city's south side. She was wearing a blood-red silk dress that rustled like dry leaves, her dark hair swept up in a tight, architectural style. Her face was flushed, her jaw clenched tight enough to snap a tooth. Neither woman noticed Clara entering. Clara kept her eyes downcast, navigating the sprawling, intricately patterned Persian rug that covered the center of the room. The tray was growing heavier by the second, her wrists trembling under the weight of the silver. "Your son ordered my husband's shipments seized at the docks," Camilla snapped, taking a step closer to the elderly woman. "He humiliated him in front of the entire port authority. You expect me to sit here and drink champagne while Damian treats us like street trash? I expect you to remember your place," Rosa said softly. She didn't look up from the fire. She reached out a gnarled, liver-spotted hand, waiting for her tea. "You are a second wife, Camilla. Your husband runs a glorified pawn shop. Damian allows him to operate out of pity." Clara was 10 feet away, 8 feet, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She just needed to set the tray down, just set it down, and disappear. "Pity?" Camilla's voice broke, shifting from angry to unhinged. The silk of her dress shrieked as she took another aggressive step forward, closing the distance between herself and the frail old woman. "Madam Costa, your tea," Clara whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the fireplace. Camilla didn't hear her. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, humiliated rage. "You arrogant old bitch," she hissed. Camilla raised her right hand. The movement was fast, a violent blur of red silk and glittering diamond rings. Clara didn't think. There was no heroic calculus in her brain, no selfless urge to protect the Mafia matriarch. What happened was purely mechanical. She saw the sudden, aggressive movement in her peripheral vision. Startled, her exhausted muscles flinched. She jolted forward to place the tray between them, a desperate instinct to create a barrier. As she lunged, the folded paper towel in her right shoe shifted. Her heel slipped. Her rubber sole caught the thick, raised embroidery of the Persian rug. Gravity claimed her instantly. The world tilted off its axis. Clara's arms flailed, the heavy silver tray slipping from her sweat-slicked palms. Time dilated into agonizing, sluggish seconds. The silver tray hit the edge of the mahogany side table with a resounding, deafening clang. The delicate porcelain teapot launched into the air, spinning end over end, spewing a wide, golden arc of scalding chamomile tea. The cup shattered against the marble rim of the fireplace, exploding into tiny, lethal fragments. But Clara was still falling. She pitched forward, directly into the space between the armchair and Camilla. Camilla's hand was already coming down in a vicious arc, aimed squarely at Rosa's face. But Rosa was no longer the target. Clara's face occupied the empty air. Crack. The sound was nauseating. It wasn't the dull thud of a cinematic punch. It was the sharp, wet smack of bone colliding with bone, amplified by the heavy silence of the parlor. Camilla's palm, laden with a heavy platinum engagement ring, struck Clara's left cheekbone with the force of a speeding brick. The impact snapped Clara's head to the side, her neck tearing with a sharp spasm of agony. White-hot pain exploded behind her left eye, blinding her. She hit the floor hard. Her shoulder took the brunt of the fall, grinding into the rug, but her face scraped against the wool fibers. The breath was driven from her lungs in a harsh, involuntary wheeze. Then came the heat. The scalding tea rained down over her back, soaking instantly through her thin black dress, burning the skin beneath. For a moment, there was nothing but the high-pitched ringing in Clara's ears. It drowned out the crackle of the fire, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Her vision was entirely white, then swimming with black spots. She lay there, curled on her side, gasping like a fish pulled from the water. She tasted copper. A warm, metallic saltiness pooled in her mouth. She had bitten her tongue. "Get up," a panicked voice screamed in her head. "You ruined the rug. You broke the china. Greta is going to kill you." She blinked, trying to force the room back into focus. Her left eye was already swelling, the skin pulling tight and hot across her cheekbone. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her palms pressed into wet tea leaves and shards of broken porcelain. One of the fragments sliced into the heel of her hand, but it was a distant, secondary pain compared to the throbbing in her skull. The ringing in her ears slowly receded, replaced by the suffocating silence of the room. Clara looked up, her vision blurring with involuntary tears of pain. Camilla stood frozen, her arms still half raised in the air. The rage had completely drained from the woman's face, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed horror. She was looking at Clara, but she wasn't seeing a maid. She was seeing the reality of what she had just done. She had struck someone in Damian Costa's house. Rosa Costa sat perfectly still in her armchair. She hadn't flinched. She looked down at Clara, a splash of hot tea steaming on the hem of her cashmere blanket. The old woman's dark eyes were unreadable, calculating. I'm sorry," Clara choked out. Her voice sounded thick, slurred by her swollen tongue. "I tripped. I'm so sorry. I'll clean it up." She scrambled, her shaking, bleeding hands desperately gathering the broken pieces of porcelain, scraping them onto the silver tray. She cut her thumb on a jagged edge, but she didn't stop. Panic was a cold engine driving her body. "Clean it up. Hide the mess. Please don't fire me." "You," Camilla stammered, stepping back. Her heel caught on the edge of the rug, and she nearly lost her own balance. "You stupid girl. Look what you did to my dress." It was a weak, pathetic deflection. Camilla knew she had crossed a fatal line. Striking a Costa, even a dowager, on neutral ground meant a war her husband couldn't win. Hitting the maid instead didn't erase the intent. "I'll pay for the china," Clara babbled, scrubbing at the soaked rug with the edge of her white apron, smearing the tea further into the expensive fibers. "Take it from my check, just please." "I didn't mean to. Leave it." The voice didn't come from Rosa. And it didn't come from Camilla. It came from the doorway. Clara froze, the breath trapped in her throat like a swallowed stone. Her hands, covered in wet tea leaves and smears of rust-colored dirt from her cuts, stopped moving. Damian Costa stood in the archway. He didn't make a grand, theatrical entrance. He didn't shout. He simply occupied the space, bleeding the oxygen out of the room. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, the jacket unbuttoned, revealing a black dress shirt with no tie. He smelled of cold night air, tobacco leaf, and something sharply metallic gun oil. He was 32, tall, with shoulders that filled the doorframe, but it wasn't his size that made people sweat. It was his stillness. He had the eyes of a deep-water predator, dark, unblinking, devoid of the emotional static that clouded normal people. He walked into the room. His leather shoes made a soft, rhythmic thud against the hardwood before he stepped onto the rug. Camilla retreated, pressing her back against the wall, her face draining of all color. She looked like she was about to vomit. Damian ignored her. He walked past Camilla as if she were a piece of ugly furniture and stopped beside his mother's chair. He looked down at the ruined tea set. He looked at the soaked, steaming patch on his mother's blanket. Finally, his gaze dropped to the floor, to Clara. Clara was still on her knees. She kept her head down, her chin tucked to her chest, trembling violently. The left side of her face was burning, the swelling already distorting her vision. A slow trickle of moisture ran down her chin from where she had bitten her lip. Damian stood there for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. He observed the scene, the trajectory of the spilled tea, the placement of the tray, the heavy, sharp ring on Camilla's finger, the angry, purple-red welt rising in the exact shape of a handprint across Clara's cheek. He pieced the geometry of the violence together in absolute silence. "Mother," Damian said, His voice was a low baritone, rough as sandpaper. "Are you burned?" "No, Damian," Rosa replied, her voice steady, though her hands were gripping the armrests tightly. The girl intercepted it. "Intercepted," Damian repeated softly. "I tripped," Clara whispered quickly, terrified they thought she was trying to play the hero. Heroes got noticed. Heroes got dragged into the game. "I just tripped. I'm sorry." Damian crouched down. The fabric of his trousers pulled tight over his knees. He was suddenly at her eye level, invading her space. Clara shrank back, her shoulder blades hitting the heavy wood of the side table. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her face. His eyes tracked the cut on her lip, the swelling on her cheekbone, the dirt and cuts on her raw, chapped hands. "Look at me," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Clara forced her eyes up. His irises were a dark, flat brown. There was no pity in them, no sweeping romantic awe at her sacrifice. He was looking at her like a broken piece of machinery he couldn't quite figure out how to categorize. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara." "Clara." He tasted the word, discarding it immediately. He stood back up, his towering height casting a long shadow over her shivering form. He turned his attention slowly, deliberately, toward Camilla. The temperature in the room plummeted. Camilla was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved against the tight red silk of her dress. She raised her hands, palms out, in a gesture of pathetic surrender. "Damian, She stepped in front of me," Camilla babbled, her voice shrill and breaking. "The clumsy idiot threw herself at me. I was gesturing. I was angry, yes, but I would never." "You raised your hand," Damian interrupted. His voice barely rose above a conversational murmur, but it carried a lethal, crushing weight. "In my house. To my mother." "No, Damian didn't look back to the hallway, but he raised two fingers. Instantly, two men in dark suits stepped into the parlor. They moved without sound, professional and cold. One was Mateo, Damian's right hand, a man with a ruined nose and dead, gray eyes. "Take Camilla to the greenhouses," Damian instructed, his eyes still fixed on the trembling woman. "Tell her husband the summit is over. If he wants to see his wife again, he will sign over the deed to the dockyards by midnight. If he hesitates, send him her left hand." "No!" Camilla shrieked. The facade broke entirely. She lunged forward, but Mateo caught her by the arm, his grip snapping her backward like a rag doll. "Damian, please, you can't do this. We have a truce. You can't break the truce over a spilled cup of tea." "You broke the truce the second you lifted your arm, Camilla," Damian said, his tone bored. "Get her out of here. Her voice is giving me a headache." Camilla screamed, kicking and thrashing as the two men dragged her out of the parlor. Her red dress snagged on the doorframe, the silk tearing with a sharp rip. Her screams echoed down the long, carpeted corridor, growing fainter until a heavy oak door slammed shut somewhere deep in the house, cutting off the sound completely. Clara remained on the floor, curled into herself. She was breathing through her mouth, trying not to sob. She didn't care about Camilla. She didn't care about dockyards. She only cared that she had witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. She had heard a death threat. She was a liability now. You don't let the maid hear you order a mutilation and then send her back to the kitchen to wash dishes. "He's going to kill me too," she thought. The realization settled in her stomach like a block of ice. "He's going to have me thrown in the river, and the landlord will throw all my things onto the curb on Friday." Damian turned back to his mother. "Are you well enough to attend dinner, or do you want to retire?" Rosa brushed a stray tea leaf off her blanket. "I will eat in my room. The smell of fear has ruined my appetite." Damian nodded once. He gestured to another guard who had materialized silently in the doorway. "Help my mother to her suite." Rosa stood, leaning heavily on her cane. She didn't look at Clara again as she shuffled out of the room, followed by the guard. Suddenly, Clara and Damian were alone. The silence was heavier now. The crackle of the fire sounded loud as a gunshot. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bullet, waiting for a pair of rough hands to drag her away. Instead, she heard the rustle of fabric. Damian crouched down beside her again. "Get up," he said. Clara tried. She pushed against the floor, but her legs were shaking so violently they refused to bear her weight. Her left knee buckled, and she collapsed back onto the rug with a pained gasp, her burned back protesting the movement. Damian watched her struggle. He didn't offer his hand. He wasn't a gentleman saving a damsel. He was a tactician, observing an injured asset. "You're shaking," he noted, his voice flat. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, cutting hot tracks through the dirt on her uninjured cheek. "Please, I won't say anything. I swear. I didn't hear anything. Just let me go back to the kitchen. Please." Damian tilted his head slightly. "You think I'm going to kill you?" It wasn't a question. Clara swallowed the copper taste in her mouth. She nodded once, a tiny, terrified jerk of her head. A muscle feathered in Damian's jaw. "If I wanted you dead, Clara, you would be dead. You took a hit, meant for a Costa." "I tripped," she insisted, her voice breaking. She needed him to understand. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't ambitious. "I just tripped on the rug. It was an accident." "The intent doesn't matter," Damian said coldly. "The optics do. She struck a member of my household. You took the physical damage. If I send you back to the kitchen with half your face swollen shut, my staff talks. The syndicates talk. They say Damian Costa lets rival mistresses beat his staff like dogs." He stood up. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clean, stark white linen handkerchief. He dropped it on her lap. "Press that to your lip. You're bleeding on my floor." Clara numbly picked up the handkerchief. It smelled of vetiver, an expensive detergent. She pressed it to her mouth, wincing as the fabric touched her cut lip. "Luca," Damian called out. Another man stepped into the room. Clara hadn't even heard him approach. "Take her to the medical wing," Damian ordered, not looking at Clara anymore. He was already pulling a cell phone from his inner pocket, his mind shifting to the fallout of the broken truce. "Have Dr. Aris check her jaw. It might be fractured. And get her a clean set of clothes. Burn that uniform." "Yes, boss," Lucas said. He approached Clara. He wasn't gentle, but he wasn't brutal. He gripped her by the uninjured shoulder and hauled her to her feet. Clara swayed, clutching the bloody handkerchief to her mouth. Her head was spinning, the room tilting sickeningly. "Am I fired?" she blurted out. The words bypassed her brain entirely, pushed out by sheer, desperate poverty. Damian stopped dialing. He turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. For the first time, something flickered in his dead, dark eyes. Not amusement, not pity, just a cold, profound confusion. She had just taken a blow from a Mafia mistress, watched a woman get dragged off to be tortured, and was actively bleeding onto $1 million rug. And her primary concern was her paycheck. "No," Damian said slowly. "You're not fired, but you're not going back to the kitchen." "Then where am I going?" Clara whispered. "To the East Wing," Damian replied, turning back to his phone. "You work for me now." The medical wing in the basement smelled aggressively of iodine, rubbing alcohol and starched linen. The girl on the examination table, Nora, though the kitchen staff had rarely bothered to use her actual name, sat rigid on the edge of the vinyl cushion. The sanitary paper crinkled loudly under her bare thighs every time she drew a shaky, shallow breath. Dr. Aris, a man with exhausted, heavy-lidded eyes and hands that smelled faintly of antibacterial scrub, pressed a latex-clad thumb gently along her left cheekbone. Nora flinched violently, a sharp hiss escaping her split, swollen lip. "Not broken," Aris murmured, his voice entirely devoid of bedside manner as he scrawled a note on a metal clipboard. "Deep tissue contusion. The swelling will peak by tomorrow morning. You will likely lose partial vision in the left eye for a few days due to the inflammation. The burns on your back are superficial, first degree, mostly. The synthetic fabric of your uniform melted slightly, but it took the brunt of the scalding liquid." He turned and slathered a thick, heavy layer of silver sulfadiazine cream across her raw shoulder blades. The greasy, medicinal chill of the ointment felt heavenly against her scorching skin. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the deep, throbbing heat radiating from her battered face. Lucas stood by the clinic door, his thick arms crossed over his chest. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't ask how she felt. He simply held a heavy plastic garment bag containing a new uniform slate gray, tailored wool blend, no apron. "Boss wants you in his study at 8 tomorrow morning," Luca grunted. "Room 4 in the staff corridor is yours now." Room 4 wasn't a dungeon, but it wasn't a guest suite either. It was a utilitarian, windowless, ensuite bedroom with heavy soundproofing, a thick, slate-colored wool carpet, and a mattress that didn't sag in the middle. Nora locked the heavy wooden door behind her. She stripped off the crinkling paper medical gown and stood under the scalding spray of the shower until the water ran ice cold. She stared down at the stainless steel drain, watching the dirt, the dried blood from her lip, and the residual grease of the scullery swirl away into the pipes. She knew she should be terrified. She was terrified. Damian Costa was a murderer. He ran an empire built on extortion, blood, and broken bones. He had just ordered a woman dragged off to a greenhouse over a slapped cheek. But as Nora dried off and sank into the clean, high-thread count sheets of her new bed, physical exhaustion violently overrode her moral panic. The cynical, grinding reality of poverty clawed at the back of her mind. A monster was paying her rent now. She wouldn't have to stuff folded paper towels into the toes of secondhand shoes anymore. She wouldn't have to breathe in lye and roasted garlic for 14 hours a day. She was trading safety for comfort, stepping out of the frying pan and directly into the Don's personal fire. But the bed was soft. For tonight, that was enough. At 7:55 a.m., Nora walked the length of the east wing. The silence here was oppressive. There were no clattering pans, no screaming head housekeepers, no hissing fryers, just the muted, rhythmic thud of her sensible, perfectly fitted leather flats against the polished hardwood. Damian's study was a cavern of dark mahogany. It smelled intensely of old paper, leather bindings, gun oil, and bitter espresso. He sat behind a massive desk, reading a leather-bound ledger. He didn't look up when she entered. Nora stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach. Her left eye was swollen to a mere slit. The bruise had bloomed overnight into a sickening landscape of plum purple, black, and jaundiced yellow. It throbbed fiercely, keeping perfect, agonizing time with her heartbeat. "Pour the coffee," Damian ordered, turning a page. Nora moved to the silver carafe on the sideboard. Her hands shook slightly. The delicate porcelain cup rattled against the saucer. She set a black espresso at his elbow and stepped back quickly, retreating to the safety of the wall. He finally looked at her. His flat, dark eyes scanned the ruin of her face. There was no pity in his gaze, no lingering romantic guilt. He studied her injury the way a structural engineer examines a stress fracture in a support beam. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his baritone voice perfectly level. "Yes, sir," Nora lied. It didn't just hurt. It felt like a hot iron was permanently pressed against the left side of her skull. "Good," Damian said smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. "Do not apply makeup to it. Do not attempt to hide it with your hair. When we have guests, you will stand by the door. You will pour the drinks. You will let everyone who walks into this room see exactly what happens when someone disrespects this house." The realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. She wasn't promoted out of kindness. She wasn't an object of affection or a damsel he wished to protect. She was a walking billboard, a flesh and blood warning sign. No one touches Costa property. By taking the hit meant for his mother, Nora had unwittingly become a physical extension of his pride. "I understand," she whispered, her voice rough. "Your salary is tripled," Damian added, his eyes dropping back to the ledger, completely indifferent to her internal revelation. Dismissed. 3 days in the East Wing felt like living at the bottom of a cold ocean. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock and the sharp scratching of Damian Costa's expensive fountain pen. Nora stood in her designated corner. The new slate gray uniform fit perfectly, but the stiff wool collar rubbed her neck raw. Her face was a ruin. The swelling had gone down, leaving a grotesque landscape of plum purple, sick yellow, and oxidized green stretching from her hairline to her jaw. The pain had settled into a dull, vibrating ache that spiked every time she chewed or spoke. Men in heavy overcoats and tailored suits cycled through the study. Capos, money launderers, Union bosses. They all did the same thing. They walked in, glanced at the hideous bruise on Nora's face, realized exactly what she represented, and immediately snapped their eyes to the floor. She wasn't a person to them. She was a territorial marker. On Thursday night, the sky broke. Rain lashed violently against the reinforced glass of the study windows, blurring the city lights into smeared streaks of amber and red. Vittorio Russo walked in at 9 del pomeriggio. He brought the storm in with him. The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing in the sharp scent of ozone, wet wool, and panic sweat. Russo was a broad man, a South Side underboss used to breaking kneecaps. But tonight, his shoulders sagged heavily. His breathing consisted of rapid, shallow rasps that rattled deep in his chest. He hadn't seen Camilla in 72 hours. Damian sat behind his desk. He didn't look up. He slowly turned the page of his ledger. Russo marched to the desk. His hands were shaking. He reached into his damp trench coat, pulled out a thick, folded legal document, and slapped it onto the mahogany. "The deed to the Southport," Russo said. His voice was cracked, desperate. "Clean titles. Everything transferred. Now, give me my wife." Damian ignored the paper. He reached for his heavy crystal glass, taking a slow sip of amber scotch. The ice clinked sharply, a tiny, crisp sound that cut effortlessly through the drumming rain. "The port covers the disruption of my business, Vittorio," Damian murmured, his voice a low, grating scrape. "It does not cover the insult to my house." Russo's jaw flexed. A thick vein pulsed wildly at his temple. "I gave you my primary shipping route. You took my livelihood. What else do you want?" Damian raised his left hand and pointed a single finger across the room. Russo followed the gesture. His eyes landed on Nora. Nora stiffened against the wall. The ambient heat from the fireplace suddenly felt suffocating. She locked her gaze on the intricate weave of the Persian rug, refusing to look at the underboss. Her heart kicked violently against her ribs. "That is Nora," Damian said quietly. "3 days ago, your wife attempted to strike my mother. Nora stepped in the way. She took the hit." Russo stared at the maid. It took 3 seconds for the reality of the demand to sink in. When it did, his face flushed, a dark, violent red. He was an underboss, a made man. The sheer, crushing humiliation of what Damian was asking hung in the air, thick and heavy. "You want me," Russo stammered, disbelief warring with rage. "You want me to apologize to a maid? I want you to apologize to the woman who bled on my floor because you cannot control your wife," Damian corrected. His voice hadn't raised a fraction of a decibel, but the lethal promise in it was unmistakable. Matteo shifted by the door. His hand rested lightly on the butt of the pistol, tucked into his waistband. Russo swallowed hard. It sounded like sandpaper. He looked at Damian, searching for a compromise, a shred of professional leniency. He found a void. Slowly, his heavy boots scuffing the wet floorboards, Russo turned toward Nora. Nora felt violently ill. This wasn't justice. This was a brutal flex of power, and she was the prop. Russo didn't care about her face. He hated her for being the instrument of his public humiliation. "I apologize," Russo choked out. His thick hands curled into white-knuckled fists at his sides. "For my wife's actions." "Louder, Vittorio," Damian said from the desk. "The rain is very heavy tonight." Russo's eyes burned with a hatred that promised graves. "I am sorry," he grated out, the words tearing his throat. "For the injury." "Good," Damian said smoothly. He opened a desk drawer and slid the deed inside. "Matteo, bring Camilla up." When the doors opened again, Camilla stumbled through. She wasn't bleeding, but she was shattered. The glamorous red silk was stained with damp earth and grease. Her hair hung in matted strings. She smelled of the root cellar and raw terror. She lunged at her husband, sobbing hysterically into his wet coat. Russo held her tightly, glaring at Damian one last time before dragging his weeping wife out into the storm. The heavy doors clicked shut. The tension evaporated instantly. Nora's knees shook. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of ozone still lingering heavily in the room. "Pour me a drink," Damian ordered. Nora walked to the sideboard. The crystal decanter was heavy in her trembling hands. She carried the glass to the desk, placing it silently on the leather blotter. "Did you enjoy that?" Damian asked. Finally, looking up at her, Nora looked at the mob boss. The smart move was to flatter him, to thank him profusely for defending her honor. But she was far too tired for survival instincts. "No, sir," she said, her voice flat and raw. "Why not?" "Because he didn't mean it," Nora said, staring at the amber liquid in his glass. "He hates me for it, and you don't care that I got hurt either. You just like proving you can make him say it." A long, dangerous silence stretched across the desk. Damian stared at her. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the glass. "You're smarter than you look, Nora," he murmured, taking a sip. He dismissed her with a slight wave of his hand. Nora walked back to her corner. The rain battered the glass. She was safe, heavily paid, and completely trapped. She had traded the grease of the scullery for the cold mechanics of a syndicate, surviving only because the monster found her useful as a shield, and shields always take the next hit. The shadows of the syndicate are rarely broken by romance. They are built on power, survival, and the cold reality of who holds the strings. Nora survived the slap, but her gilded cage comes with a much steeper price. Did she make the right choice, trading the kitchen for the Don's study? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you love this gritty, realistic Mafia drama, hit the like button, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel.